Something was wrong. I felt it before anyone said a word. The chamber was built for beings much taller than us, with walls that curved upward like the inside of a shell, glowing faintly with a soft green light that pulsed in slow rhythm, almost like breathing. I stood near the back of the human delegation, my translator badge cold against my chest, watching Ambassador Laura Bennett present our third gift in 20 minutes. Her hands were steady, but I could see the tension in her jaw. None of the gifts had worked. Not one. The Veil Queen sat on a throne that was not a throne at all, but a raised platform surrounded by pulsing light, her long limbs folded with unnatural stillness. She had no visible mouth that moved when she spoke. Her words came to us through her attendants, translated through the hive link, a strange telepathic thread that connected every veil in the room to her mind. Ambassador Bennett stepped forward and presented a case holding rare crystalline metal, mined from the outer belt of our solar system, worth more than most countries could produce in a year. The Queen did not even look at it. One of her attendants, a tall veil with markings like flowing silver ink across its skin, spoke in a flat voice. "The Queen does not want this." Bennett's shoulders tightened, but she pressed on. Next came a data core filled with the schematics of our newest defense satellites, offered as a gesture of trust. Rejected. Then came cultural artifacts, paintings, music, even a recording of human children laughing, something our cultural attaché had insisted would show the veil our humanity. Rejected. All of it. The room grew colder with every failure, not in temperature, but in mood. I could see sweat forming on the brow of our lead scientist, Nathan Price, standing beside me. He leaned toward me and whispered, "If she keeps saying no, we are finished here. She'll see us as nothing." I did not answer. I was watching the Queen's antennae, the thin appendages above her eyes that seemed to move when she felt something. They had not moved once during the entire meeting. Until now. The chief attendant went still. His body language changed in a way I had learned to read over the years of studying the veil, a subtle straightening of the spine that meant something important was about to be said. The Queen's voice came through the hive link, translated a heartbeat later into words that filled the chamber. "There is only one human I want." Every human froze. Bennett's eyes widened. Nathan Price actually took a step forward, as if compelled, thinking perhaps she meant him, the brilliant scientist who had spent a decade studying veil biology. I saw the military attaché straighten his uniform, certain it must be him, the war hero who had negotiated 3 ceasefires with hostile factions before this mission. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. Then the Queen's antennae turned, ever so slightly, toward the back of the room. Toward me. The chief attendant's head turned as well. Then another attendant. Then a third. Every veil eye in that chamber, dozens of them, slowly shifted until they were all fixed on me, standing quietly near the wall with my translator badge and my clipboard, a person nobody in that room had thought worth noticing until this exact moment. I felt my stomach drop. "Ethan," the attendant said, and the word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "The Queen wants Ethan Cole." For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. I actually turned around, foolishly, to see if there was another Ethan standing behind me, some higher-ranking official who happened to share my name. There was no one there, just a wall and the soft green glow of veil architecture and the weight of every eye in the room now resting on me. Ambassador Bennett turned slowly, her expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. "Ethan," she said quietly, as if testing whether the sound of my name might somehow make more sense the second time. It did not. I was a translator, nothing more. I had joined this mission because I spoke 3 veil dialects fluently and had spent years studying their culture from a small research post on the edge of colonized space. I was not important. I was not a decision-maker. I did not command soldiers or design weapons or hold degrees that filled entire walls with framed certificates. I was, by every measure that mattered to the people in that room, the least significant person present. And yet the most powerful being in this entire sector of space had just looked past ambassadors, scientists, and decorated officers to speak my name. The chief attendant gestured for me to step forward. My legs did not want to move, but somehow they carried me anyway, past Nathan Price, who stared at me with an expression I could not quite read, past Ambassador Bennett, who placed a hand briefly on my arm as I passed, a silent question I had no answer for. I stopped a respectful distance from the throne platform, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain the veil could hear it through the hive link. Up close, the queen was even more overwhelming than she appeared from across the room. Her eyes, large and dark, seemed to hold depths I could not begin to understand, ancient in a way that made the weight of centuries feel almost visible. Her antennae dipped slightly in my direction, a gesture I had read about in old survey reports but never witnessed myself. It was, according to those reports, a sign of recognition reserved only for individuals of extraordinary importance within Vale society. I bowed my head, unsure what else to do, and waited. The hive link carried her words a moment later, translated through the chief attendant, though I could have sworn I felt something pass through my own mind as well, faint and strange, like a whisper at the edge of hearing. "You do not remember me," the attendant said, relaying her words, "but I remember you." I lifted my head slightly, confused. I had never met this queen before in my life. I had never even been permitted near Vale royalty until this very mission. Whatever she meant, it was not something I understood. Behind me, I heard Ambassador Bennett shift uncomfortably, and I imagined the entire human delegation exchanging silent, panicked glances, trying to piece together what possible history I could have with a being as powerful and untouchable as the Vale Queen. "I do not understand," I said carefully, choosing my words the way I had been trained to, respectful, simple, without assumption. "I have never had the honor of meeting you before, my queen." The chief attendant relayed my words, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The queen simply looked at me, her dark eyes unblinking, as if she were seeing something layered beneath my face that no one else in the room could perceive. Then her antennae rose, and the hive link carried her voice once more, quieter this time, almost gentle in a way I would never have expected from a being who had just refused every gift an entire planet had offered her. "Not me," the attendant translated, "someone who was mine." A ripple of confusion passed through the Vale attendants themselves, a slight shifting of posture, a faint murmur along the hive link that I could somehow sense even without understanding its words. Whatever the queen was referring to, it seemed to surprise even her own court. I felt the eyes of every human behind me boring into my back, waiting, desperate for some explanation, some reason why an insignificant translator had just become the single most important person in this negotiation. I had none to give them. The queen rose from her platform, slowly, deliberately, and for the first time since we had entered the chamber, every Vale attendant in the room lowered themselves in a gesture of deep respect. She moved toward me with a grace that seemed impossible for a being so large, until she stood close enough that I had to fight the urge to step backward. Her voice came through the hive link one final time, and this time, the chief attendant did not translate it as a formal statement, but as something quieter, almost personal. "You will come with me," the attendant said. "There is much you do not know, and much I must explain." I glanced back at Ambassador Bennett, silently pleading for guidance, for permission, for anything that might tell me what I was supposed to do. She gave a small, uncertain nod, though I could see the worry etched into every line of her face. I turned back to the queen, and though every instinct told me to be afraid, there was something else beneath that fear, a strange pull I could not explain, as if some part of me already understood that my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined walking into that room. "All right," I said quietly, "I will come." The queen's antennae dipped once more, and without another word, she turned and moved toward a hidden passage behind the throne platform, one that had not been visible until this very moment. I took a breath, steadied myself, and followed her into the unknown, leaving behind every certainty I had carried into that room and every assumption about who I thought I was. Behind me, I heard Nathan Price whisper to Ambassador Bennett, his voice trembling with something between confusion and disbelief. "Why him?" he asked. "Out of all of us, why does she want him?" I did not have an answer, not yet. But as I stepped through the passage and the green light swallowed the sound of the chamber behind me, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. I was about to find out. The passage narrowed as we walked, the glowing walls pulsing faster now, almost matching the pace of my own racing heart. The Queen moved ahead of me in silence, her long form gliding rather than walking, and I found myself struggling to keep pace despite her unhurried stride. Every step took me further from everything familiar, further from the safety of my own delegation, further from the version of myself that had walked into that meeting room believing he was nothing more than a translator standing quietly in the back. Whatever waited at the end of this passage, I had the growing sense that it would change everything I thought I knew, not just about the veil, not just about this queen, but about myself, and about some forgotten moment in my past that had apparently mattered more than I could have ever guessed. The light ahead grew brighter, and I walked toward it, uncertain, afraid, and yet unable to stop moving forward. The passage opened into a private chamber, smaller than the throne room, but no less strange. Soft light drifted from crystals embedded in the walls, and strange plants grew along the edges of the floor, their leaves shifting slightly, even though there was no wind. The Queen settled onto a low platform and gestured for me to sit across from her on a cushioned seat that seemed built, almost impossibly, to fit a human frame. "You prepared this room for a human," I said, before I could stop myself. "Before today, before you even knew I would be in that meeting." The chief attendant, who had followed us in along with two silent guards, translated my words, and the Queen's antennae shifted in what I was beginning to recognize as amusement. "I have been preparing this room for 3 years," the attendant relayed, "since the day I learned your name." 3 years. I tried to think back, searching my memory for anything that could explain this. 3 years ago, I had been stationed at a small research outpost on the edge of colonized space, translating minor trade agreements and studying veil linguistic patterns from data collected by survey drones. It had been quiet work, forgettable work, the kind of assignment nobody remembered afterward. Except for one night. The memory surfaced slowly, like something rising from deep water. A storm had knocked out communications at the outpost. I had been walking the perimeter fence doing a routine equipment check when I found something in the mud near the tree line, a shape too strange to be human, too small to be one of the large predators native to that world. It had been a veil. Wounded, bleeding a dark fluid from a wound along its side, barely conscious, half buried in the mud from what looked like a crash landing. I remembered the fear, the way my hands had shaken as I knelt beside it, uncertain whether touching it would trigger some defensive reaction, uncertain whether reporting it would mean it was captured, interrogated, perhaps worse. I remembered making a decision in the space of a few heartbeats, the kind of decision that has no logic behind it, only instinct. I had carried it back to the outpost medical bay myself, treated the wound with supplies meant for human injuries, and kept it hidden for 2 days until it was strong enough to leave. I never reported it. I never told anyone. As far as I knew, it had simply vanished back into the wilderness the way it came, and I had assumed, for 3 years, that the entire incident had been forgotten by everyone except me. "That was you," I said slowly, looking up at the Queen. "The scout in the mud. That was someone connected to you." The attendant paused before translating the Queen's response, as if choosing the words carefully. "That scout was my daughter," the attendant said. "She was gathering information on your species when her ship was struck by debris and forced to crash. She should have died there. Veil medical needs are complex, and human supplies were never designed for our biology. And yet she lived, because a human soldier with no rank, no authority, and no reason to help her, chose to save her life anyway." I sat back, stunned. I had known the scout was Veil. I had never known she was royalty, let alone the Queen's own daughter. If I had known that at the time, I might have made a very different decision, terrified of the consequences of interfering with something so far above my understanding. She could have told anyone that story, I said. Why does it matter so much? Soldiers help wounded creatures. It happens. The Queen's antennae twitched, and this time, when the attendant spoke, there was an edge of something sharper in his voice, something almost like frustration mixed with wonder. You do not understand what you are, the attendant said. You saved an enemy scout who had been sent to gather intelligence that could be used against your own species. You had no orders to do so. No commander told you to. There was no strategic advantage in saving her, no reward waiting for you, no punishment awaiting you if you had simply reported the crash and let others deal with it. Or worse, let her die in the mud where you found her. And yet you carried her, treated her, hid her, and asked for nothing in return. I opened my mouth to respond, but the Queen was not finished. She rose from the platform and moved closer, her presence filling the small chamber in a way that made the air itself feel heavier. For 3 years, the attendant continued, I have had every gift your species has offered analyzed by my finest scholars. Weapons, technology, art, trade agreements. None of it interested me, because none of it explained what my daughter told me when she returned. She said a human found her in the mud, broken and helpless, an enemy by every measure that matters in war, and chose to save her simply because she was suffering, not because of orders, not because of gain, because it was the right thing to do, and doing the right thing mattered more to him than his own safety. The room fell silent for a long moment. I felt the weight of her words settle over me slowly, and for the first time, I began to understand the shape of what was happening. You have spent 3 years studying an act of kindness, I said quietly. I have spent 3 years trying to understand a species that acts against its own interest for reasons that have nothing to do with calculation, the Queen said through her attendant. My people are built on hierarchy. Every action within the hive serves a purpose, a function, a benefit to the whole. We do not act without reason. We do not risk ourselves for strangers, let alone enemies, unless commanded to by the needs of the hive. What you did should not have happened, and yet it did. I thought back to that night in the mud, the storm raging around me, the strange creature bleeding in front of me, and the simple, unthinking decision to help. I had never considered it remarkable. I had never even told anyone about it, assuming it was the kind of thing any decent person would have done in my position. Any human would have done the same, I said. The attendant paused before translating this, and when the Queen's response came, there was something almost sorrowful in her tone. That, she said, is precisely why I fear your species, and why I need to understand you more than any weapon or alliance could ever teach me. I frowned, confused by the shift in her words. Fear us? We offered you gifts. We came here seeking peace. The Queen moved back toward her platform, settling onto it slowly, her dark eyes never leaving mine. A species that calculates, she said through the attendant, can be predicted, negotiated with, understood through logic and self-interest. But a species that acts without calculation, that risks everything for reasons rooted only in feeling, cannot be predicted at all. You cannot be bought with gifts, because your loyalty is not for sale. You cannot be threatened into obedience the way other species can, because fear does not always outweigh what you believe is right. That unpredictability terrifies my court, and yet it is also the very thing that makes you valuable beyond measure, if it can be understood, and perhaps even guided. I sat with that for a long moment, the weight of her words settling into something I had never considered before. I had always thought of kindness as ordinary, unremarkable, simply the way decent people behaved. I had never imagined it could be studied as a strategic anomaly by an alien empire that spanned dozens of worlds. So that is why you rejected every gift, I said slowly. None of them mattered, because what you actually wanted was standing quietly in the back of the room the entire time. The attendant translated, and for the first time since I had entered the chamber, the Queen's antennae lifted in a gesture I recognized instinctively, without needing translation. It was something close to relief. "Yes," she said, "I did not want your ships. I did not want your medals or your weapons or your art. I wanted to understand the mind that could look at a wounded enemy in the mud and choose mercy over advantage. I wanted to know if that mind was alone, or if it represented something larger within your species. And I wanted to know if that mind would be willing to remain here, within my court, so that I might learn from it directly." The request settled over me slowly, and I realized, with a growing sense of unease, exactly what she was asking. "You want me to stay," I said, "not as a diplomat, not as a translator, as something else entirely. As my guest," the Queen said through her attendant, "as my student, and perhaps in time, as my teacher. There will be those within my court who resist this. Hierarchy does not easily accept an outsider granted such standing, especially a human, a species many of my nobles still view as primitive and unworthy of respect. You will face resistance, perhaps danger, but you will also have my protection, for as long as you remain useful to my understanding, and perhaps, if I am honest, for reasons that go beyond mere usefulness now." I thought of Ambassador Bennett, waiting anxiously beyond that passage, of Nathan Price and his careful calculations, of the entire human delegation that had come here hoping to secure trade agreements and defense treaties. None of them could have imagined that the true purpose of this meeting had nothing to do with politics at all, and everything to do with a single, unremembered act of kindness performed 3 years ago in a rainstorm. "I need time to think," I said honestly. "This is not a small request." The Queen's antennae dipped in what I understood now as acceptance, perhaps even respect for my hesitation rather than blind agreement. "Take the time you need," she said, "but know this. Whatever you decide, you have already changed how I see your species, and how my court will see you from this moment forward. There is no undoing what has already begun." As I rose to leave that chamber, my mind spinning with everything I had just learned, I could not shake the feeling that the Queen was right. Whatever simple act of mercy I had performed 3 years ago in the mud, it had set something in motion far larger than myself, and there would be no simple way to step back from it now. The passage behind me led back toward the throne room, but I already understood that I would never see it, or myself, the same way again. I chose to stay. The decision took me 3 days, 3 days of long conversations with Ambassador Bennett, who worried I was walking into a trap, and with Nathan Price, who could not stop asking questions about Vale biology he hoped I might answer once I had access to the inner court. In the end, I stayed for a simpler reason than any of them expected. I had spent years studying a species that most of humanity still viewed as distant and unknowable, and here was a chance to understand them from the inside, to build something real instead of watching from behind glass. I did not fully understand, not yet, what that choice would cost me. The palace, once I moved into its inner halls, revealed itself as a place of quiet, constant tension. Every Vale I passed in the corridors watched me with expressions I could not always read, some curious, some wary, some openly hostile. Word had spread quickly that the Queen had granted an outsider, a human, standing within her personal court, a privilege that had never before been extended beyond the hive itself. The first noble to confront me directly was a tall, sharp-featured Vale named Lord Threx, whose markings ran in jagged patterns across his shoulders, unlike the smooth, flowing lines I had seen on the Queen and her attendants. He found me in the palace gardens on my 4th morning, standing near a fountain that glowed faintly blue in the shifting light. "You do not belong here," he said, his voice carrying through the hive link with none of the careful diplomacy the Queen's attendants used when speaking to me. "The Queen has made an error in judgment, one that threatens the order of this court." I kept my voice level, remembering everything I had studied about Vale's social hierarchy. "I understand this is unusual," I said. "I am not here to challenge anyone's position. I am simply here because the Queen asked me to be." Threx's antennae flattened against his skull, a gesture I recognized from my research as a sign of open hostility. "The Queen asked you to be here because a moment of sentiment clouded her judgment." My daughter was among those who argued against your presence in the strongest terms. You are a curiosity to her, nothing more, and curiosities fade. When you do, those of us who understand true order will still be here, ready to correct what has been broken." He left without waiting for a response, and I stood by the fountain for a long time afterward, turning his words over in my mind. I had expected resistance. I had not expected it to feel this personal, this immediate, as though my very presence had already become a battlefield in a war I did not fully understand. Over the following weeks, the resistance grew more creative and considerably more dangerous. The first incident happened during a formal court gathering, an event meant to introduce me to the wider Vale nobility as the Queen's guest. I had been given ceremonial food to sample, a gesture of welcome that every guest of standing was expected to accept. As I lifted the dish to my mouth, a young Vale servant standing near the head table suddenly knocked it from my hands, spilling the contents across the polished floor. The room went silent. I looked down at the servant, a small, nervous-looking Vale with pale markings, clearly terrified of what she had just done in front of the entire court. "I apologize," she stammered through the hive link, her voice trembling. "I did not mean to, I saw something, I thought—" Before she could finish, two guards moved toward her, their posture suggesting punishment was imminent for what appeared to be a clumsy and humiliating mistake in front of visiting nobility. "Wait," I said, stepping between the servant and the guards. "Let her explain first." The chief attendant, standing near the Queen's platform, translated my words with visible surprise. The guards paused, uncertain, looking toward the Queen for guidance. She said nothing, watching the scene unfold with the same unreadable patience I had come to associate with her. The young servant, whose name I would later learn was Pell, finally found her voice again. "The dish smelled wrong," she said quietly. There was a scent beneath the spices, something I recognized from my training in the kitchens, a compound that should not have been there. I panicked. I did not know what else to do. A murmur passed through the hive link among the gathered nobles, something I could sense even without understanding its exact content. The chief attendant knelt quickly and examined the spilled food, using a small device from his robes to test the residue on the floor. After a long, tense moment, he rose and spoke directly to the Queen, his voice grave. "She is correct, my Queen. There is a compound in this dish that would have caused severe internal damage to a human within minutes of consumption. It was not part of the prepared meal." Quote, the room erupted into low, urgent conversation along the hive link, a wave of alarm passing visibly through the gathered nobles. I looked down at Pell, who was trembling, clearly terrified of the consequences of having exposed an assassination attempt in front of the very court that had likely orchestrated it. "You saved my life," I said to her quietly, kneeling so we were closer to eye level. "Thank you." Pell looked up at me, her dark eyes wide with something between fear and disbelief, as though she had expected punishment rather than gratitude for what she had done. The Queen rose from her platform, and the room fell silent instantly. Her antennae moved in a sharp, decisive gesture, and when her voice came through the hive link, it carried an authority I had not heard from her before, cold and absolute. "Someone within this court attempted to poison my guest," she said. "This will not be tolerated. I want to know who prepared this dish, and I want to know before this gathering ends." The investigation that followed revealed nothing conclusive, though I noticed Lord Threx was conspicuously absent from the remainder of the evening's proceedings, a detail that did not escape the Queen's attention either, judging by the sharp look she gave the empty space where he usually stood. That night, I found Pell again, sitting alone in a small alcove near the kitchens, still shaken from the events of the evening. I brought her a warm drink, something I had learned was customary among the kitchen staff after a difficult shift, and sat with her quietly. "Why did you help me?" I asked. "You could have stayed silent. No one would have known you noticed anything at all." Pell considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I have heard the stories," she said, "about what you did for the Queen's daughter, years ago. I did not believe them at first. A human, risking himself for one of us, with nothing to gain. It seemed impossible. But watching you these past weeks, the way you speak to servants the same way you speak to nobles, the way you never seem to calculate what something will cost you before deciding whether to help, I began to think perhaps the stories were true after all. So you decided to test it, I said, understanding now. By seeing if I deserved to be saved. I decided I did not want to find out I was wrong, Pell said quietly, by watching you die in front of me. I thought about that conversation often over the following days, turning it over in my mind as the palace continued to buzz with rumors and quiet accusations. The poisoning attempt had done what Lord Threx likely never intended. It had strengthened my position within the court, rather than weakened it. Word spread quickly of how a lowly servant had risked her own safety to expose a hidden threat, inspired, many claimed, by the very human she had helped protect. Not everyone was convinced, however. A second attempt came only 2 weeks later, this time far more direct. I had been walking alone through one of the palace's outer corridors, a rare moment of solitude I had begun to treasure amid the constant scrutiny of court life, when I heard a soft mechanical whir behind me. I turned just in time to see a small drone, no larger than my hand, hovering near the ceiling, a thin red light blinking along its underside. Before I could react, it launched itself toward me with startling speed, a narrow blade extending from its casing. I threw myself sideways, my shoulder colliding hard with the corridor wall, and the drone shot past me, embedding its blade into the stone where I had been standing a moment before. It pulled free almost instantly, spinning in the air to reorient itself for a second attack. I had no weapon, no training in Veil combat technology, nothing but instinct and the adrenaline now flooding through my body. As the drone lunged again, I grabbed a decorative vase from a nearby pedestal and swung it into the device with as much force as I could manage. The impact sent the drone spinning wildly into the wall, its blade shattering against the stone, its small frame sparking before falling still on the floor. I stood there, breathing hard, staring at the broken device, when I heard footsteps rushing toward me. It was Pell, along with 2 palace guards, all 3 of them clearly having heard the commotion. Pell knelt immediately beside the fallen drone, examining it with the same careful attention she had shown the poisoned dish weeks earlier. "This is a hunting drone," she said grimly, "modified for use against larger prey. It should not exist within the palace walls." The guards exchanged uneasy glances, and I understood immediately what they were thinking. Someone with access to restricted palace resources had smuggled a weapon designed for one purpose alone, and had used it against me in a corridor I had believed to be safe. Word of the attack reached the Queen within the hour, and by evening, the entire palace was locked into a tense, simmering silence. Guards stationed at every major junction, nobles whispering behind closed doors, the hive link itself seeming to hum with an undercurrent of anxiety that I could almost physically feel even without direct access to it. The Queen summoned me to her private chamber that night, her expression, as much as I could read it, carrying something close to genuine concern. "This cannot continue," she said through her attendant. "I underestimated how deeply my court would resist your presence here. I can offer you additional protection, guards assigned specifically to your safety, restrictions on your movement through the palace." I shook my head slowly. "If I hide behind guards and restrictions, I become exactly what your nobles already believe me to be, a fragile curiosity that cannot survive without protection, that will not convince anyone that humans deserve the respect you are trying to teach your court." The Queen's antennae shifted, something like surprise passing through her posture. "You would rather remain vulnerable than accept protection." "I would rather earn my place here through my own actions," I said, "than have it handed to me through force. If your court is going to accept me, it needs to be because they choose to, not because they are afraid of your guards." The Queen studied me for a long moment, and when she finally responded, there was something in her voice that felt almost like respect. "You are either remarkably brave," she said, "or remarkably foolish. Perhaps, among your species, those 2 things are not so different." The following weeks brought no further direct attacks, though the tension in the palace never fully faded. I continued my daily routines, spending time in the gardens, the libraries, the kitchens, speaking with nobles and servants alike, treating each with the same simple respect I had always believed anyone deserved, regardless of their station. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. Servants who had once avoided eye contact began greeting me openly in the corridors. Younger nobles, curious rather than hostile, began seeking me out with questions about human customs, about the strange concept of choosing kindness without calculating its cost. Even some of the older, more traditional court members began treating me with a cautious, if still reluctant, civility. Pell became something of a constant companion during this time, guiding me through the unspoken rules of palace life that no official briefing could have prepared me for, translating not just words, but the subtle currents of veiled social expectation that governed every interaction within those walls. "You are changing things," she told me one evening as we sat together in the palace gardens beneath the soft blue glow of the fountain lights. "Not just for yourself, for all of us. The younger servants speak differently now, about what kindness means, about whether hierarchy alone should decide who deserves protection and who does not." "I never meant to change anything," I said honestly. "I only wanted to survive long enough to understand your people the way the Queen understands mine." Pell smiled, an expression I had learned to recognize in the subtle curve of her mouth, so different from a human smile yet carrying the same warmth. "Perhaps that is exactly why it is working," she said. "You never tried to change us. You simply showed us something different was possible, and let us decide for ourselves whether we wanted it." I thought of Lord Threx then, still lurking somewhere within the palace, still convinced that my presence represented a threat to everything he believed the Vale Empire should be. I thought of the poisoned dish, the hunting drone, the quiet, simmering resentment that had not yet fully faded, despite the growing acceptance I felt building around me. Whatever peace I had found within the palace walls, I understood it remained fragile, balanced precariously against forces that had not given up, and would not give up, simply because a few servants and curious young nobles had begun to see me differently. Somewhere beyond those walls, I sensed, a larger storm was gathering, one that would test not just my place within the Vale court, but the very future of the fragile trust growing between two species who had only just begun to understand each other. I did not know yet how right that instinct would prove to be. The message from Ambassador Bennett arrived on a morning that had otherwise felt calm, delivered through a secure channel the human delegation had been permitted to maintain since my arrival at the palace. I read it twice before I fully understood what it was asking of me. Bennett wanted intelligence, not overtly, not framed in those exact words, but the meaning beneath her careful diplomatic language was unmistakable. Earth's leadership had grown restless watching me settle into a position of unprecedented trust within the Vale court, and they wanted that trust converted into something they could use: defense capabilities, fleet movements, the location of resources that might strengthen humanity's position in future negotiations. I sat with the message for a long time before responding, staring out at the palace gardens where Pell was tending to the strange, glowing plants that lined the fountain's edge. I wrote back carefully, explaining that my position here was built on trust, not espionage, and that using it to extract secrets would destroy everything I had worked to build, not just for myself, but for the fragile relationship growing between our two species. Bennett's response came quickly, and it was less understanding than I had hoped. She reminded me that I had been sent on this mission representing humanity, not myself, and that whatever personal relationship I had developed with the Queen did not exempt me from my responsibilities to my own people. Earth needed allies, she wrote, and allies were built on more than good intentions. They were built on tangible advantages, and right now I was sitting on the greatest advantage humanity had ever been offered. I did not respond to that message for 3 days. During that time, the political situation within the Vale court grew increasingly tense, though not because of anything related to Earth. Rumors began circulating through the Hive Link about movement along the Dominion's outer borders, unusual patterns detected by long-range sensors, patterns that some of the older nobles recognized with visible alarm. I learned the details from Pell one evening as we walked together through one of the palace's quieter corridors, away from the ears of the hive-link that seemed to permeate every public space. "The Korath," she said quietly, using a word I had never heard before. "An old enemy of my people, from before even the Queen's rule began. They have been quiet for generations, content to remain within their own territory. The sensors suggest they are moving again, and moving in this direction." "How dangerous are they?" I asked. Pell's expression, as much as I could read it, carried genuine fear, dangerous enough that the last war against them nearly ended the Vale Empire entirely. If they are truly moving toward our borders, the Queen will need every resource, every ally, every advantage she can gather, simply to survive what is coming. I thought of Bennett's message then, still unanswered, sitting in my private quarters. If the Vale Empire was truly facing an existential threat, humanity's position had suddenly become far more valuable than any negotiation over trade agreements or defense treaties could have ever made it. And I was the one person with direct access to the Queen during what might become the most critical moment in Vale history. The temptation to use that access, to finally give Bennett something concrete to work with, gnawed at me over the following days. I told myself it would not be a betrayal of the Queen's trust, simply an act of loyalty to my own species during a moment when strategic advantage might mean the difference between humanity's survival and its irrelevance in a galaxy suddenly reshaped by war. I brought my concerns to the Queen directly, choosing honesty over calculation, the same instinct that had guided every decision I had made since first finding her daughter in the mud 3 years ago. "My own people want me to use my position here for advantage," I told her, sitting across from her in the same private chamber where she had first explained why she wanted me at her court. "They believe that if I do not, I am failing my responsibility to humanity." The Queen's antennae shifted slowly, and when she responded, there was something almost weary in her voice. "And what do you believe?" "I believe trust cannot be built on secret advantage," I said. "If I betray your confidence now, everything we have built together becomes worthless, not just for us, but for the future of any real alliance between our species." The Queen studied me for a long moment, her dark eyes carrying depths I still could not fully understand even after weeks in her presence. "The Korath are already moving," she said finally. "My scouts confirm it. Within days, perhaps weeks, they will reach territory close enough to threaten this very palace. I will need allies, human or otherwise, if the Empire is to survive what is coming." "Then let me help you honestly," I said, "not through secrets stolen for my own people's advantage, but through an alliance built openly, one that benefits both our species, because it is right, not because either side has been deceived into it." The Queen was quiet for a long time after that, and I could see the weight of the decision settling over her, the same way it must have settled over her 3 years ago when she first learned what a human soldier had done for her daughter in the mud. "There are those within my court," she said finally, "who will use this crisis as an opportunity, not to save the Empire, but to remove me from power entirely. Lord Threx has grown bold in his opposition. If he believes I am weakened by this threat, distracted by the need to defend our borders, he may act against me directly." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. "A coup," I said. "During a war." It would not be the first time in Vale history that ambition outweighed survival, the Queen said grimly. "If Threx moves against me now, the Empire will fracture at the exact moment it needs unity most, leaving us vulnerable not just to the Korath, but to our own internal collapse." I thought of Ambassador Bennett's message still waiting for a response, of the pressure from my own government to extract advantage from a crisis I now understood carried consequences far beyond anything Earth's leadership had likely imagined. I thought of Pell, and the servants who had begun to trust me, and the younger nobles who had started to question whether hierarchy alone should determine who deserved protection. And I thought of Lord Threx, and the poisoned dish, and the hunting drone in the corridor, small warnings of exactly how far he was willing to go to remove what he saw as a threat to the order he believed in. I need to send a message to my own delegation, I said finally. Not to extract secrets, but to explain what is happening here. If the Korath threaten the Vale Empire, they will eventually threaten human territory as well, once the Empire falls and there is nothing left standing between them and the rest of the galaxy. This is not just your war. It never was. The Queen's antennae lifted slightly, something that might have been hope flickering across her expression. You would ask your people to fight alongside mine. I would ask my people to see what I have seen, I said. That the difference between calculated advantage and genuine alliance is the difference between a partnership that collapses the moment it becomes inconvenient and one that survives because both sides chose to stand together when it mattered most. That night, I wrote a message to Ambassador Bennett that was nothing like what she had asked for, and everything like what I believed humanity actually needed. I explained the threat of the Korath honestly, the danger facing the Vale Empire, and the opportunity, not for stolen advantage, but for a genuine alliance built on trust rather than deception. I did not know how she would respond. I did not know whether Earth's leadership would see the wisdom in standing beside a species they barely understood, against an enemy they had never encountered, for reasons rooted in principle rather than immediate strategic gain. But I knew, with the same certainty that had guided me through the mud 3 years ago, that it was the right thing to do, regardless of the cost. 3 days later, Lord Threx made his move. I learned of it from Pell, who burst into my quarters before dawn, her expression carrying a fear I had never seen from her before, not even during the poisoning attempt or the hunting drone incident. "The Queen has been taken," she said, her voice trembling through the hive link. "Lord Threx has moved against her during the night. He claims she is unfit to lead the Empire through the coming war, that her attachment to you has clouded her judgment beyond recovery. He has seized control of the palace guard, and he means to have her removed from power before the sun fully rises." I felt the floor seem to shift beneath me, the careful balance I had been building for weeks suddenly collapsing into chaos. "Where is she now?" I asked, already moving toward the door. "Held within the lower chambers," Pell said, following close behind me. "Guarded by those loyal to Threx. If we do not act quickly, he will move against her permanently before the rest of the court even learns what has happened." I thought of everything I had learned since arriving at this palace. Every conversation with the Queen, every small act of trust built between us over the weeks, every servant and noble who had begun to see something different in the way humans and Vale might coexist. I thought of the Korath, moving closer with every passing day, and the certainty that without the Queen's leadership, the Empire would fracture at the exact moment unity mattered most. I had a choice to make, the same kind of choice I had made 3 years ago in the mud, without calculation, without certainty of the outcome, guided only by the conviction that some things mattered more than personal safety. "Then we do not have time to wait for anyone else to act," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Show me where she is being held." Pell hesitated only a moment before nodding, and together we moved through the darkened corridors of the palace, toward whatever confrontation awaited us in the chambers below. The lower chambers of the palace were unfamiliar territory, a maze of narrow corridors used mostly by kitchen staff and maintenance workers, far from the grand halls where nobles conducted their business. Pell led me through passages I never would have found on my own, her knowledge of the palace's hidden pathways proving more valuable in that moment than any weapon could have been. We stopped near a junction where 2 guards stood watch outside a sealed door, their posture rigid, their attention fixed forward in the disciplined stance of soldiers following orders they had not questioned. "They are loyal to Threx," Pell whispered, "but not all of the guard has turned against the Queen. Many simply do not yet know what has happened. If we can reach the ones still loyal, we may be able to reverse this before it is too late." I thought quickly, drawing on weeks of observation within the palace. Every conversation, every relationship I had built with servants and guards alike who had slowly come to see me as something other than a curious outsider. "There is a guard captain named Vorin," I said, remembering a conversation from several weeks earlier, a quiet, thoughtful soldier who had once asked me detailed questions about human concepts of duty and loyalty during a rare moment of downtime. He seemed uncomfortable with the idea of Threx's ambitions even before this happened. If we can reach him, he may be willing to help. Pell nodded, and we moved quickly through another passage, avoiding the 2 guards stationed at the sealed door, until we found Voron stationed near the palace's eastern entrance, clearly confused by the sudden reshuffling of guard assignments that had occurred overnight. "Something is wrong," Voron said as soon as he saw us approaching, his hand instinctively resting near his weapon. "I was told the Queen ordered a change in security protocols during the night, but the orders came through Threx's personal channel, not hers directly. Because she did not give those orders," I said. "Threx has seized her, claiming she is unfit to lead through the coming crisis. He means to remove her from power before the rest of the court learns what has happened." Voron's expression shifted from confusion to something harder, more resolved. "I suspected something like this might happen," he admitted. "Threx has been gathering support among the guard for weeks, quietly, using the threat of the Korath as justification for stronger, more decisive leadership. I did not want to believe he would move against the Queen directly. Will you help us?" I asked directly. "Not because I am asking, but because you know this is wrong." Voron studied me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing everything he had witnessed since my arrival at the palace. The poisoned dish, the hunting drone, the slow, quiet shift in how servants and younger nobles had begun speaking about kindness and loyalty in ways that had nothing to do with calculated advantage. "I will help," he said finally, "not because you asked, but because the Empire cannot survive what is coming if it tears itself apart from within first." Voron gathered a handful of guards he trusted absolutely, soldiers who had quietly expressed discomfort with the overnight reshuffling of duties, and together, our small group moved back toward the lower chambers where the Queen was being held. The 2 guards outside the sealed door recognized Voron immediately, their posture relaxing slightly at the sight of a familiar superior officer, giving us the crucial seconds we needed to close the distance before they fully understood what was happening. Voron spoke quickly and quietly to the guards, using arguments and reasoning I could not fully follow through the hive link, but the effect was clear. Within moments, both guards lowered their weapons, convinced by Voron's words, or perhaps simply relieved to find themselves given a reason to abandon orders that had never felt entirely right to begin with. The door opened, revealing the Queen seated on a simple chair within an otherwise bare chamber, her posture regal despite the circumstances, her dark eyes lifting immediately toward the doorway. "Ethan," she said through the hive link, her voice carrying something I had not heard from her before, genuine relief mixed with surprise. "You came. I told you I would earn my place here through my own actions," I said, stepping into the chamber. This seemed like exactly the moment to prove that was not just words. The Queen rose from the chair, and I could see the exhaustion in her movements, though her resolve remained unshaken. "Threx believes he has already won," she said. "He has gathered enough support among the court to declare himself regent during the coming crisis, using my supposed weakness as justification. If we do not act quickly, he will solidify that support before I can reach the wider court to challenge him directly. Then we go to the court now," I said, "before he has the chance to finish what he started." The journey back through the palace felt different this time, no longer a desperate rescue through hidden passages, but something closer to a procession, as word spread quickly through the hive link that the Queen had been freed, and that she was moving toward the great hall where Threx had already begun addressing the assembled nobility. We arrived to find the great hall filled with tension, Threx standing near the throne platform, addressing a crowd of uncertain nobles with confident, measured words about the necessity of strong leadership during times of crisis. He froze mid-sentence as the doors opened and the Queen entered, flanked by Voron's loyal guards, and by me. The room fell into stunned silence. "This is not possible," Threx said, his composure cracking for the first time since I had known him. "You were secured, contained, by guards who believed they were following legitimate orders," the Queen said, her voice carrying through the hive link with an authority that filled the entire hall. "Orders you gave without my consent, using a crisis you did not create to seize power you were never granted." Threx's antennae flattened in open hostility, and I could see him calculating, searching for some way to salvage the situation before it slipped entirely beyond his control. "The Empire needs strength right now," he said, turning to address the gathered nobles rather than the Queen directly. "Not a ruler distracted by sentiment for an outsider species, weakened by attachment to a single human when the Korath themselves are moving toward our borders. The Korath threaten every world within this empire," the Queen said, "and yet you chose this exact moment to fracture our unity from within, rather than strengthen it. Tell me, Threx, whose interest does that truly serve? The Empire's survival or your own ambition?" Murmurs spread through the assembled nobles, and I could see doubt creeping into expressions that had likely been swayed by Threx's earlier words. This was the moment, I realized, where everything would be decided, not through weapons or force, but through the simple, difficult truth of what each side actually represented. I stepped forward, aware of every eye in the hall shifting toward me, the human whose presence had started this entire conflict within the court. "I did not come to this world seeking power," I said, my voice carrying through the hive link with help from Pell, who stood nearby translating my words into the formal register the court expected. "I came because your queen showed me something I did not expect from a species I barely understood. Curiosity without cruelty, strength without unnecessary aggression, a willingness to question assumptions rather than simply enforce them through hierarchy alone." I turned to face the gathered nobles directly, many of whom had watched my presence within the court with suspicion for weeks. "Lord Threx believes attachment to principle makes a leader weak," I continued. "But consider what that principle actually achieved. It brought forward a servant who exposed a poisoning attempt rather than staying silent out of fear. It brought forward a guard captain who chose loyalty to what is right over blind obedience to convenient orders. It brought your queen, freed from captivity, standing before you now, not because of force, but because enough of you recognized what was actually happening and chose to act against it." The hall remained silent, but I could feel something shifting in the air, the same subtle change I had noticed weeks earlier among the servants and younger nobles who had slowly begun to see kindness, not as weakness, but as something that could build genuine loyalty in ways that fear and hierarchy alone never could. Threx, sensing the shift in the room, made one final desperate attempt to reclaim control. "This is exactly the danger I warned against," he said, his voice rising. "A human, standing in this hall, speaking as though he understands what it means to lead the Vale Empire through the greatest crisis in generations. This is madness." "Perhaps," the Queen said quietly, her voice cutting through his rising anger with calm, absolute authority. "Or perhaps it is exactly the kind of madness this empire needs, if we are to survive what is coming. The Korath do not care about our internal hierarchy, Threx. They will not pause their advance to acknowledge whichever noble claims the strongest bloodline or the most rigid adherence to tradition. They care only about conquest, and an empire fractured by ambition from within will fall to them far faster than one united by genuine loyalty, even loyalty built on principles as strange and unpredictable as those my human guest represents." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat once again, just as I had during that first meeting weeks ago when the Queen had spoken my name before an entire delegation. This time, however, the silence broke differently. One by one, the assembled nobles began to kneel, not toward Threx, but toward the Queen, their gesture of loyalty spreading through the hall like a slow, rolling wave. Threx stood alone amid the growing display of submission, his ambition finally, visibly, collapsing around him as he realized the court had chosen its answer. "Guards," the Queen said finally, her voice carrying no cruelty, only the weight of necessary judgment. "Escort Lord Threx to confinement, where he will remain until the current crisis has passed, and the full weight of his actions can be properly considered." Voran and his soldiers moved forward, and Threx did not resist, his posture carrying the defeated stillness of someone who understood the moment had already passed beyond his control. In the days that followed, the Vale Empire moved with renewed unity toward preparing for the Korath's advance. Human forces, following the message I had sent to Ambassador Bennett, began arriving in small but meaningful numbers, not as spies seeking stolen advantage, but as genuine allies standing beside a species they had only recently begun to understand. The battle against the Korath, when it finally came, tested everything both species had built together. Vale tactics, rigid and precise, combined with human instincts for improvisation and unexpected sacrifice in ways that neither species could have achieved alone. I watched human soldiers risk themselves to protect Vale scouts, and Vale warriors return that same unexpected loyalty toward human forces, a partnership built not on calculated advantage, but on the same simple principle that had started this entire journey 3 years ago in the mud. When the Korath forces finally withdrew, having encountered a unity they had not anticipated between two species with no history of alliance, the celebration that followed within the palace carried a different quality than any court gathering I had witnessed before. Servants and nobles alike moved through the halls together, the rigid hierarchy that had once defined every interaction now softened by weeks of shared struggle and genuine cooperation. The Queen summoned me to the Great Hall one final time, though this gathering carried none of the tension of that first meeting weeks ago. The entire restored court stood assembled, nobles who had once viewed me with suspicion now watching with something closer to respect, servants who had once avoided my gaze now standing openly among the crowd. Pell stood near the front, her expression carrying quiet pride, and Vorin stood nearby as well, now formally recognized as captain of the Queen's personal guard, a position earned through loyalty that had proven itself when it mattered most. The Queen rose from her throne, and the hall fell silent, exactly as it had during that first meeting when she had rejected every gift humanity offered and spoken a single unexpected name. "Weeks ago," she said, her voice carrying through the hive link to every corner of the restored court, "I stood before a delegation from a species my people barely understood, and I refused every gift they offered, because none of those gifts could explain what I had witnessed 3 years earlier in a distant rainstorm. I sought instead the mind capable of choosing mercy over advantage, kindness over calculation, for reasons that had nothing to do with strategic gain." She turned to face me directly, her dark eyes carrying the same depth I had noticed during our very first conversation, though now filled with something warmer, something that felt less like curiosity and more like genuine affection built through shared struggle and hard-won trust. "I found that mind in a translator no one else in that room considered significant," she continued. "A human who saved a wounded enemy without calculating the cost, who risked his own safety again and again, not for reward, but because it was right. A human who chose honesty over stolen advantage even when his own people demanded otherwise, and who stood beside my throne during the darkest hour this empire has faced in generations." She paused, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "There is only one human I want standing beside me," she said, her voice carrying not just through the hive link, but through something that felt, for the first time, like it reached me directly, unfiltered by translation. Not as a guest, not as a curiosity to be studied, but as an equal whose presence within this court has taught my people something no gift, no weapon, no treaty could have ever achieved. The chief attendant stepped forward, and this time, when the Queen spoke, there was no need for careful translation, no formal distance between her words and their meaning. "Ethan Cole," she said, and the sound of my name filled the restored hall exactly as it had weeks ago, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. Then, it had been a shock, a mystery no one understood. Now, it was a recognition earned through weeks of trust, sacrifice, and genuine partnership between two species who had chosen, against every calculation of advantage, to stand together when it mattered most. I looked out at the assembled court, at Pell's quiet pride, at Vorin's respectful nod, at nobles who had once viewed me with suspicion, now watching with something closer to acceptance. And I understood, finally, everything the queen had been trying to teach her people since the moment she first learned what a human soldier had done for her daughter in the mud. Kindness, offered without calculation, without expectation of reward, had proven more powerful than every gift, every weapon, every treaty humanity had brought to that first meeting. It had built something neither species could have achieved alone, a partnership rooted not in strategic advantage, but in the simple, unpredictable, and ultimately unbreakable choice to do what was right, regardless of the cost. And as the queen spoke my name once more before her restored court, I understood that whatever came next, whatever challenges still awaited both our species in the vast unknown of the galaxy beyond, we would face them together, not as calculated allies, but as something far stronger and far harder to break.